My name is Elena Narinskaya, and I'm a founding director of Women's Ministries Initiative, an educational forum facilitating discussion on various timely, important, and often difficult subjects. This is a second webinar in the series titled Living Christianity Today. At the first webinar, we spoke about iconography on now, and there were some very important reminders that emerged from this conversation. I hope that some of these important reminders we can carry on into this discussion. Our main guest today, or our first guest today, is Dr. Alfred Osborne. Dr. Osborne was born in 1938 in Alexandria, Egypt, and went to America as a child, where he completed his education and his PhD at the University of Cincinnati. He was ordained as a deacon in the Orthodox Church in 1969, became a priest in 73 and a bishop at 93. He served the church until his retirement in 2009. The didactic message of this webinar is to give a historical scale of the problematic behind different religious calendars. It's aimed to allow us to understand of how religious calendars shapes our religious identities and creates divisions on one's loyalty to one or the other religious calendars. Our guest panelists today are Professor Mary Cunningham, Professor Thomas O'Loughlin, and Dr. Vassa Larin. To kickstart today's webinar, I will ask Dr. Osborne to elaborate on his academic interest in religious calendars. Here I have his recent book titled A Cosmic Liturgy, published by Ripples, one of the series. And as far as I know, there is another book in making. So Dr. Osborne, what ignited your interest in religious calendars in the first place? You have to unmute yourself. It was tricky, James, if you can help with that.
Sorry about that. Well, in retirement, I sort of took up academic pursuits and was very much interested in the transition, really, from Christianity, from Judaism to Christianity, and in particular in the issue of the liturgy. And this led me to look into the calendar, and I came across the work of Annie Joubert, writing in the 1950s, a French scholar, and her work on the 364-day calendar, which was used at Qumran, and her thesis that it actually had a distinct influence on early Christian liturgy. Well, that did prompt my interest, and I began to look at the background of that calendar. And the book, which I have just published, is the result of that work, a part of the result of that work. And what it does is show that the 364-day calendar is a creation calendar. And it is a creation calendar in two senses. One is that the week, the liturgical week, is based on the first week of creation. Joubert was confronted with the fact that in the 364-day calendar, the Sunday, Wednesday, and Friday are quite clearly the privileged liturgical days of the week. It's on those days that the liturgical events of real significance take place. But she wasn't able to come up with an answer as to why this was the case. And in my book, I take a very simple approach. I say, well, there's one day of the week which we understand why it's the liturgical significance. That's Saturday. That's the seventh day of creation, the day on which the Lord rested, and we rest as well. So I then went back and said, just a second, there's a very interesting aspect of the liturgical 364-day calendar, that it begins on a Wednesday. You might think that a 52-week calendar would begin on Sunday, the first day of the week. But no, it begins on Wednesday. And why does it begin on Wednesday? That's the day that the sun and the moon and the stars were created in Genesis 1. And that is therefore the beginning of time. There is no time before the fourth day of creation. And that, if you're familiar with the tradition, time and the calendar is of extreme importance. And obviously that it suggests that that is the day. What's the reason why it's the used for liturgical purposes? In fact, the first day of every month in that calendar falls on a Wednesday, the first day of every season. The two major festivals of weeks and of booths, fall on Wednesday, and that seems quite clear. But if we look at Friday, there's a sort of a problem there. The only feast that falls on a Friday is actually the Day of Atonement. But if we look at the Genesis narrative, we see that the creation of man takes place on the Friday. What better day to assign the Day of Atonement than on the day on which man was created? And this leaves then Sunday to be accounted for. And the Book of Jubilees has what one might call an alternative creation narrative. The Book of Jubilees, by the way, uses the 364-day calendar and assumes that it's absolutely essential for the practice of the Jewish religion. But it assigns to the first day of the creation of the angels. And I put this together with another aspect of that tradition, and that is the cryptic and occasional reference to a cosmic covenant. And that covenant is the covenant that governs the running of the world. And the running of the world is actually, according to Jubilees, in the hand of angels. The unseen power that moves everything that lives or that moves is an angelic power. So the cosmic covenant can be shown, therefore, to have been sworn between the angels and God on that first Sunday of creation. And it's for that reason that in Jubilees, the successive covenants of Noah, Abraham, and Jacob all take place on Sunday. They are continuations of the cosmic covenant. So that then establishes basic liturgical character of that week. But it's also based on a cosmology which is actually quite difficult to ascertain. The chapter 80 of the Book of Enoch, which is part of the astronomical book, concerned with Enoch's vision of the heavens as they were created. It's rather enigmatic, but I think I'm successful in explaining why there is no use of the moon in the 364-day solar or creation calendar. And that is because the moon at the time of creation is actually created opposite the sun, and it always stays opposite the sun. So as the moon rises, the sun sets, and as the sun sets, the moon rises, and that cycle is completed all the time. This means that the moon is always full from throughout the year, just as the sun is always full whenever it's in the sky. And so that those 2 points about the creation calendar, which means that the liturgy in its sort of actualization puts the participant in touch with the world as first created. And the subsequent fall of the angels, which includes the fall of the 7 planets, leads to the present heavens that we have today, which obviously don't follow the 364-day calendar. The sun circles, it goes 365 and a quarter times, half, whatever, in the course of the year. And the moon goes through phases 12 or 13 times a year. So the liturgy then puts one in touch with creation as willed and wished by God until there was disturbance based on defection from the creation calendar. So there are 2 further points that might be of interest. One is that it seemed to me quite clear that the Epistle of Jude, which actually cites the book of Enoch as scripture, it's possible to see that behind his theology, and particularly his theodicy, is the cosmology of the 364-day calendar. He knew that cosmology, and if he knows the cosmology, he almost certainly followed the calendar itself. And the other point is that if you examine the creation narrative in Genesis 1, chapter 1, 14 to 19, which describes the creation of the heavens, it seems to me quite clear that what is being described there is not the heavens as we see them, but as we would see them on the day of creation. In other words, this is the calendar is actually written into the narrative in Genesis. That creates a certain problem. How did knowledge of that calendar get from Genesis to Jude? Well, we know that in the middle of the 2nd century, there was extensive conflict over the calendar in Judaism. And that's because of the material from Qumran. But what we also know is that conflict, and indeed the 364-day calendar itself, is never mentioned in either the Christian or Jewish traditions. It has been edited out, in spite of the fact that it was used for 200 years, 20 miles from Jerusalem. So I thought to myself, and I now move on to the 2nd book, that is, we must, in order to understand this period, reinsert the calendar into the history of the 2nd century BC. And what we know is that the last high priest, whose reign was universally admired and he was considered to be a strict traditionalist, was Ananias III, who was removed from office in 175 BC. And there's a sequence of events after that, beginning a struggle which went on for 20 and more years over what calendar should be used, because his brother Jason replaced him. 3 years later, he was replaced in turn by Menelaus, who introduced for the first time the lunar calendar, which is used today, which is based on sun and the moon. And within 4 years, there was civil war. Jason, who had been removed, attacked Jerusalem and took it. He conquered Jerusalem. And apparently, he was driven out only by the forces of the Seleucid king. The Menelaus returned, eventually it was clear that Menelaus could not bring peace to Jerusalem. He was killed by the king, and another high priest appointed, Alcimus, who reintroduced the 364-day calendar. And there were about 10 years in which it was used until it was replaced at the time of Jonathan Maccabee, who also secured the high priesthood directly from the king, and in due course introduced the lunar calendar. This left a deep scar on Judaism. And it's what's interesting, I mean, what's further of greater interest, if we then switch and don't look at the sources that are preserved in Greek and Latin, which don't mention the calendar at all, but look at the sources which we know from Qumran and from Jubilees and the Book of Enoch, which were preserved only in the mountains of Ethiopia. If they hadn't been preserved there, we would never have that text. They were preserved, discovered at the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century, and gradually have been the object of increased study. Both of them advocate that solar calendar as a requirement. But the point is that if we look at the material that comes out of the Qumran, in addition to this material we have from Ethiopia, it can be shown that this pattern, which I tried to develop and did develop from the historical sources, is reproduced in the Qumran material. So we can have a history now of the 364-day calendar. But what's interesting also, and I will just stop at this point, is that if it's found in Jude, who calls himself a brother of James, the brother of the Lord, where else is it found? What other traces do we have in the New Testament? And in that case, we'll finish up now. If we go back to a very interesting article written by a Polish Jewish scholar, published in 1921, a man named Mark Lizbarski, he addresses the question of the meaning of Jesus of Nazareth. Now, it was one thing our F.C. Burkett said in 13, 14. It's almost certain that Jesus was called Jesus of Nazareth, or the Nazarene. The only problem is we don't know what it means. And in fact, we don't know what it means today. Lizbarski had a very interesting theory. He went completely from a Semitic end, and using the meaning of the Hebrew root of Nazareth as a verb, said this means that Jesus belonged, Lizbarski said, to a sect which considered itself to be preservers and guardians of the Torah. He then said, these people will no doubt have been related, believe it or not, to the Mandeans, because they also consider themselves Natsoraya, Natsaye, that is, guardians of the Torah, and could easily be called the Nazareans. But of course, there was no proof for that because it's not true. But what Lizbarski didn't know was that, in fact, there was a group that preserved the Torah in their own eyes, of course. And that was all those people who followed the 364-day calendar, which included, of course, the community at Qumran, but many others. And it's out of that group that Christianity arose. So what we have here in the 2nd century is a struggle over the calendar between a calendar which was highly theoretical, was basically mythological in character, based upon a vision of creation, as it was in the first week, and as it no longer is, and a calendar, the lunisolar calendar, introduced by Menelaus, then again by Jonathan Maccabee, which actually is based on the heavens which we see and uses the sun and the moon to regulate time. But the point I would make is, in relation to what we have here in front of us as a subject, is that the calendar was perceived as basically an essential of religious worship. That traditional calendar was absolutely had to be maintained, and maintained at any price, even at the price of civil war initially, but in the end, at the price of going into internal exile. So any calendar dispute that we have today or anywhere else in the world, I think this calendar dispute probably tops it in terms of significance and passion.
Thank you very much for this extensive and in-depth historical introduction to the problem. Now I want to bring it in contemporary realities where the struggle of the calendar continues and the complexity of the issues is developing in the reality of Orthodox world based on the calendar is divided. In that sense, it addresses another question, which I'm bringing to Professor Thomas O'Loughlin. What do you think is a religious calendar? Is it a divine initiative or is it a human response? What is this, the complexity and the tension when people go out of their way to draw division based on their understanding of religious calendar and calculation? What lies beneath their differences in understanding?
Well, first, thank you, Elena, for inviting me to. I feel very incompetent following immediately after Alfred, because I am aware that Alfred is, many scholars, since it was first realized in the early 1950s that Qumran has used another calendar, have sought to work on it. And I think Alfred is the first person who has actually come up with a consistent reading of all the sources. So I stand in awe of his learning. Working with Qumran is always difficult, and working with calendars requires both mathematical skills and incredibly detailed ability to organize information, and he can do it. So I feel, you know, I am a lesser being. The curious thing about any religious group is that we like to think of ourselves as having some very profound ontological DNA that makes us this group, such as we know how the heavens work, we have the truth. But actually, belonging to any group is very much a matter of how we remember together. It's because we share memory that we identify with one another. And every time we have liturgy, we reenact our memory. And in reenacting our memory, we are, to play on words, we are remembering the group. We are making ourselves members of the group. Now, people who study memory, and Connerton's work, How Societies Remember, I consider to be not only the most brilliant work, but a most easy to read work. Connerton, working 40 years ago, pointed out that what makes us into groups and into societies are the things we do together with a certain regularity. So, for instance, it could be as simple as that On a certain day, we all put out the bin. On a certain day, we're all paid. It's on a certain day, we all go to the pub together. We all go to football on a certain day. And then we build up other regularities. There are things we have to do less frequently than once a month, once a week, or once a day, or once a week. There are things we need to do once a month. In an agricultural society, that's usually some sort of market. We go to market once a month, and the market is in a certain place on a certain day. We don't experience that very much today, but still in France, everyone knows the day that all the little vans arrive and you go down and you buy your cheese. And so the market forms part of what glues a society together. And linked to that, we then put in, that's when the fun fair comes to town, and that's when we have our celebrations. So it's not so much that the group exists outside of us, but that we belong to a group, and the group we belong to keeps together because we have a shared consciousness, we share a memory. And one of the ways we share a memory is we share time. Now think of how fundamental that is. Imagine we said, I'm going to meet you. The first thing we have to do is we have to agree on a time. So if we don't have shared time, we can't have shared community. And so we find that every society identifies itself with its time. Just think of last Christmas. The scientists said having Christmas is crazy. Christmas is not, for many people, a religious festival, but it is shared time. It's part of our vision of what a year should be. We may not actually meet with our family. We may actually dread meeting with our family, but in our minds, Christmas is part of us. It makes us who we are. It tells us who we belong to and who belongs to us. And the feeling was just so strong. Governments, not just in Britain, but in Ireland and elsewhere, they said, okay, we must have Christmas. And 3 weeks later, we paid for it with a spike in the COVID deaths. So a calendar is very much part of not only who I am, but it also tells me who I am not. So if it's consciousness that's more important to a group, the idea that we have a shared descent is more important than the actual blood or DNA we have, and we have to agree on times for the regularities of life, then we don't think we own the calendar, we think the calendar owns us. It is Christmas, therefore we have to celebrate, not we have to celebrate and let's call it Christmas. Now, if the calendar becomes part of my identity, and it is, and you say, oh, well, that wouldn't be true of modern, non-religious, secular people. Well, imagine I said to you, I would, speaking to this audience, I'd say, we're now in Lent. We're in the time before Easter. For everyone that's on this webinar, there are meaningful time markers. We're after Christmas. But what if I said, we're approaching the end of the first quarter? You'd now know that I'm using a different type of calendar, and you'd suddenly know an awful lot about me. So the calendar becomes one of the ways that I defend my identity. And that's something you can experience if you're ever traveling in a Muslim country on a Sunday. You know, there's no difference. Or if you're in an airport in a Muslim country on a great Christian feast. I remember once flying out of Istanbul on Easter Sunday morning. It just didn't have any, didn't make no impact. And I arrived in Heathrow, and even though the international area, people were aware this is a festival day. And so we defend the calendar as part of the defending of our identity. And anyone who challenges the calendar is not just saying, you've got your arithmetic wrong. They're actually saying there's something wrong with your identity. Now, the sad thing is, a calendar can be used to exclude and divide. I think we can understand that process through thinking of how calendars and time and memory work. But equally, calendars can unite. And so calendars are very important if Christians today want not only to live together, but want to see how they can work and live and witness together rather than be involved in disputes and fights. So the very fact that everyone listening to me knows something about a calendar, and a calendar is impinging on them in a very interesting, they all know, everyone listen, you all know the day you have to put the bin out or the recycling out. You also know the birthday of someone that you dare not forget. You remember your own birthday, which comes up once a year. We're not only looking forward to Easter, we're looking forward to having time off, the time of the calendar called holidays. So it impinges on us. It forms identity. It can divide, but it can unite.
Thank you, Tom. It is incredible, your overview of the tensions and the loyalties and the divisions and the unities, the potential that comes out of the insignificant in the first view question of the calendar. So I'd like to follow on and address and give the Zoom to Mary, where maybe you can share with us this chicken and egg question, calendar and identity, and the tension between them. And I will complicate it even more, the question of loyalties to one's calendar or loyalties to one's particular identity that can potentially conflict with the loyalties of the gospel message, i.e. love and avoidance of divisions at all cost as a detrimental factor. So if you can unmute yourself and give your presentation, that would be most appreciated, Mary.
Well, thank you very much, Elena, and thank you, Alfred, for being here. And I would just like to start and echo Tom by saying how impressive I found Alfred's book and hoped it would be somewhat of a focus for the discussion today. It's extremely detailed and very technical in places, but it presents a system of which I had no idea, this 364-day liturgical calendar that seems to have been used in a strand of Judaism in the period of the Second Temple, which has a wonderful symmetry, and various things about that impressed me enormously, which I would just like to say before I get on to answering your question, Elena, which I will come to. But if people were defending this calendar, and if that included the people at Qumran and possibly Jesus of Nazareth, it is something that apparently is a calendar that was believed to be synchronized or in line with God's plan and with the original creation. And as Alfred was outlining in his introduction, the people who celebrated the festivals that fell on the same day of the year every year according to this calendar, such as the Day of Atonement, felt that they were joining into a heavenly choir of angels. And he does point out in his book how this was picked up in Christianity, and we see it sort of emerging in the writings of Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite in the 6th century, this idea that we're part of a cosmic liturgy, and that we need to do this not just to remember, not just to reenact, but to participate in this liturgy, which somehow sustains and keeps fulfilling that original creation, in expectation of a final day, of course, which will come at some point in history. So to defend a calendar like that, and if there were groups of Jews and Christians who felt that it needed to be defended or that it was being sidelined, seems a very different thing to me than the kinds of divisions we see today between some of the churches, between the Julian and the Gregorian calendar, for example, which I'm sorry to say have always seemed to me just to be to do with disputes about rather arbitrary calendars that were set at particular points in history, but to have nothing theological behind them. And I'm sure many people will disagree with me on this, but it becomes something that people adhere to without any particular understanding of why this is. And of course, the Julian calendar is now quite removed from the solar calendar. The Gregorian calendar brought us back to some extent in line with the solstice of the sun in December, and it reflects the need to readjust. So to have churches divided on this basis, and even in schism on this basis, has always seemed to me to be a tragedy, because I don't see what the theological basis for it is. So that would be my reply, and I'm sure it's controversial. Just to come back to the question of identity, I would certainly not deny that sometimes the impetus for adhering to a calendar, the old calendar or the new calendar, or even to different religious calendars among the world religions, can be a statement of identity. It can be extremely important for communities to feel that they are doing this together, but also that it's something that only they do and that sets them apart, either from other Christians or from other world religions or from the civil calendar or a secular world that's doing something else. So that has its positive as well as its negative sides. I certainly agree with Tom on that. And for people to share a collective memory, to hold the same days sacred, and to feel that they as a group share this, and to be absolutely firm in refusing to be diverted or accept change from that because it's part of their identity, I think I can understand too. But at the same time, I still do feel it's tragic. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm absolutely in awe of how this conversation is developing. And I want to thank everyone thus far participating, because we can see in front of our eyes the mystery of the calendar, the mystery of creation, and the mystery of our own appropriation in our own identity of that understanding. So my next speaker, Dr. Sister Vassa Larin, I would like you to carry on with this conversation and bring it to the basic human challenge of understanding the world as an attempt to understand God. And as Alfred, in his introduction, made the mystery of the calendar related to the mystery of creation, I would make an attempt to address the question further in people tending to separate each other's attempts in understanding God and understanding creation and the mystery of it. And sometimes the rationale behind the human appropriation can be an enormous encouragement and furtherment, if there is such a word, of theology, of everything else. And here is this duality that calendar can represent. So Sister Vassa, as a liturgist, as a practicing Orthodox and as an educator, I'll give you the Zoom.
Elena, oh wait, am I unmuted? I am. Hello, and I'm also in awe of all the previous speakers and Dr. Osborne. I have learned so much, and I am not, it's not an area of my expertise, the Qumran findings, but I've dabbled in it a bit. And I'll share that I think on the one hand, because I deal with this every day, as Elena, you called me an educator or something like that, I have a weekday podcast. So I repetitively cover the, the meanings of the weekdays, compare them to, say, the central god Woden inspiring the name for Wednesday, the central mysteries of Christianity being in the center of the week, or Mittwoch, with the cross and the virgin birth, the Theotokos being the leitmotifs of the Octoichos. And then I try to relativize, because I have both new calendar and older calendar subscribers, to relativize also, because I cover the new calendar and then the older calendar saints of the day, and trying to just chip a little bit away at the dogmatization of the differences, because I say things like, look, there are very basic differences that go back further than these very superficial, as Professor Cunningham correctly mentions, there are no deep issues that people are to the slightest extent aware of, that one must fight for with respect to particularly the Julian calendar. But I'll point something out, like even the numbering of those days is fascinating to me, because we know that numerology is so important for our tradition, that something so basic, forget about the difference in 13 days, but Wednesday is Tetarti for the Greeks. It's, in Hebrew, it's also Yom Ravieh, it's the fourth day, but for Russians, Четверг is the fourth day, Thursday is the fourth day. And that is a significant difference in perception, biblically speaking, right? So what is the center? And as far as identity goes, I try to, as I relativize these meanings in the sense that I don't find them unimportant, but I also recognize that today we have a higher, having said that, yes, the calendars and our perception of time is important for identity, right? It's obviously the way we do things, our rituals unite us, but I think we have a much higher tolerance as church, and I use the term church, not pretending to know everything that encompasses, but very broadly as church, we have increasingly become more able to live with an identity that is confronted with other identities, other communities, especially in the age of the internet. But even before that, we are not as sensitive when we see the canonical legislation in our Byzantine tradition about you know, if you walk into a synagogue, or if you put up a candle in a you know, non-Catholic church, or some para-synagogical, you know, temple, well, a Christian one, but a heretical one, you know, you're excommunicated, or you can't touch this, you can't touch that. In our liturgy, supposedly, all of those uninitiated should be dismissed, right, before the Eucharistic canon begins. But already for a long time, we don't have this sensitivity. And, you know, once in a while, there are the weirdos that will practice that, and just as some kind of an exotic exercise, the you know, the non-Orthodox will leave the church. But we don't need to do that, and we haven't done it for centuries. What I want to say is that we seem to not be so threatened by the others. And I don't find in my own church world that people are any longer, not people, already people of my generation, and I'm already middle-aged, we don't really think that the new calendar, and I always put that in quotes because, and I call the older calendar the older just to underline, because you know that new means bad in Orthodoxy, but I say it's just, it's not that new, people. Like, once it's, you know, I mean, 400 and, you know, plus years, is, we can basically agree that it's not new. But we are not sensitive. For example, if we take this week, Elena, feel free to you know, invite me to stop. But I want to say this week, for example, we don't fast on Wednesday and Friday, right, of the publican and Pharisee. And it's not because, as everybody will tell you, or most priests will explain, so that we're not like the Pharisee who boasts about, you know, not fasting twice a day. It's because, as if you know, chapter 49 of the Typicon, that explains why, because of that fast of the Ninevites, because the evil Armenians fast around this time, right? That's why we don't, because around this time, the Armenians, the Council of Trullo already was very into distancing us from Armenian traditions. And so at the time, the others, and just like the reason we fast on Wednesdays and Fridays, according to, I think it's in, chapter 8 of the Vivahi, that because the hypocrites fast on Mondays and Thursdays, the hypocrites being the Jews. So towards the end of the 1st century, or the beginning of the 2nd, however you date the Vivahi, the first mention of the Wednesday fast is just so that we're not like them. That's how sensitive we were. We had to distance ourselves from the Judaism of the time. That's why we fast, because it's not clear why to fast on a Wednesday, right? So we understand that our fasting, and we know in the Old Testament, fasting was definitely a mark of identity. It was a defense mechanism for the chosen people, whether it's Daniel and the 3 youths in Babylonian captivity. It's their fasting, it's what they refuse to eat that exposes them, so to say, as not belonging. And so it is a protective measure. I was recently reading about this in Peter Brown's book, The Eye of a Needle, that I never managed to really finish reading, but he talks about this thrill that Christianity had. He's exploring, as everybody here might know, the development of Christian communities in the West throughout, I don't know, 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries. And so he's talking about the organization of counterculture and the sort of countercultural thrill of martyrdom, of not following the same time and the same rituals in those times, in late antiquity and a bit later. So I think it's understandable, and it's not bad, and it's very needed today to have these identity building, very human needs of belonging, also through church culture, right? In our very identity, well, destroying kind of culture of so much diversity that just bombards us all the time, because the internet doesn't have ordered time. You're everywhere all the time. The expression, 24/7, you're always on, it makes you less human, because there is no hierarchy of meaning in the way information is presented to you in the internet, right? In this information age. But in liturgical time, it is ordered, but we can see that we're less sensitive as church, forget about the internet, but as church, even while we're not fasting this week because of the evil Armenians, but that comes from, well, it's quite late, but one can guess, 13th, 14th century, probably a little bit earlier. But who cares today, for example, that this year Ramadan is beginning on the evening of April 12th, and that is more or less in the middle of the Orthodox fasting period. So we're going to be fasting with not the Armenians, right, who are Christians, right, but the Muslims, who perhaps should be more threatening to our sense of identity. Granted, they fast in quite a different way, but in some ways, well, some of us dress like them already, so I don't know, they might be closer to threatening our identity than we might think. So I want to say we have a stronger or a thicker skin, and I don't see our calendar issue going away anytime soon, because we fail really to educate people. We're afraid, it's the tail that wags the dog and so forth, to tell people the truth about this and say, this is not, but we shouldn't take it very lightly either, because, I grew up as an older calendar, Russian Orthodox, daughter of a priest, and I celebrated Christmas, and we picked up the Christmas tree that was discarded by the neighbors and used it. And this type of thing actually was sort of also a thrill. And my parents raised me to be like, we're special, right? That was sort of a positive thing in childhood, where anyway you see things in black and white, and this helped you to say, we are not like, okay, so the children in school already received their Christmas presents, you didn't, but that's a good thing because we're different, we're more dedicated. That's the way it was. But today, neither my siblings nor I, people grow up. We don't see things in black and white anymore. And we don't feel threatened by the fact that, I have in 3 minutes walk from my apartment to Greek Orthodox churches. I don't feel that they are somehow less than or that we're better than. And I know simply exposed to a lot of difference. So I just want to suggest that we maybe will be, these are like the tares amongst the wheat. Some of our ill-advised, probably, tendencies to hold on to things that we don't need. I think they can also simply be approached differently. Yes, it binds me with those fasting in the same way right now, but say I know the Church of Finland is not on our same Paschal calendar and they're off, right? And is it the Church of Latvia or someone in the Baltic regions also uses the Western Paschal calendar already within Orthodox communion? It's not perfect, right? But I think we can both foster the identity of our immediate community and also be, I call it on my podcast, in the interest of calendar solidarity. Let's now talk about the feast at hand for the older calendar folks, even though you new calendar people, we talked about it, and we older calendar people also celebrated with you 2 weeks ago. Let's talk about this again. And people say things like, oh, I don't have that, but I have you know, okay, it's not that many, but it's 530 or so people now, these the subscribers, and they are always positive about this. They say, we like that, you know, it's not perfect, but they like to have it repeated. And I think just like we're not threatened by Ramadan overlapping with our fasting, and we're not threatened by the catechumens not being let out, even though it's not enough to say it once. For our forefathers, they had to just like, all right, we get it, we're going, right? I think they were probably saying, but we know through the studies of the catechumenate in Constantinople, that already at the turn of the millennia, nobody was escorting them out, because I think that the work of the Holy Spirit from generation to generation does, you know, despite a certain theology of demise, that everything went downhill more or less when John of Damascus died. There's really nothing worth mentioning after that, maybe Palamas. There is progress. There's progress, and I think we might have the ability to manage that. Not everybody has to do things the same way as we do, and nonetheless, we can come together. I mean, all right, that's enough. Thank you for letting me share.
Thank you, Sister Vassa, and incredibly important. I would like to emphasize what you mentioned about being threatened and address it to all of our guests and panelists. And can we afford to keep on being threatened? And with this threatening our identity, and I extend it to the maximum, our identity as a Christ bearers, no matter where we bear it, in which geography, in which social construct, or in which church for that matter. This is a crucial question that I would like us to ponder after this webinar. Can we afford to be threatened? And now we will take a little bit more time. We decided to add 10 more minutes to the webinar, so I won't be concluding it just yet, because I want to have another round and bring it back to the beginning, to Alfred. And without asking questions, I would give you the Zoom to share with us your thoughts of this webinar and something maybe that evolved in you or emerged. Thank you.
Well, I was struck by the question that Mary raised, and that is, what was Jesus' attitude towards the calendar? Well, it must strike everyone that he never mentions it. And my take on the situation is that the revelation which is given in Christ is a kind of breaking out of that whole framework, and an acceptance that there are only three things of importance in the world, or in all that is. One is God. Two is the world that God created. And three is the other person. I think that covers everything that's said in the Gospels.
Thank you. That is very difficult to follow, but Tom, the Zoom is yours.
I would just say amen. Every Christian and every Jew does their theology with their back to Auschwitz. In other words, behind us is the effect of Auschwitz. And I think we all have been hurt. You know, we're different, we're special. That's a very dangerous way. We've all used it. you know, where you praise your own, just, we're not like them, we're not like them. The danger with that is that it's built on an idea of antagonism and fear, rather than on a mutual sharing and a mutual pursuit of the truth, which is the work of the Spirit in our hearts. So, just as I would say to politicians who govern by fear, you know, you got to do this because we're, you know, it's going to, that's not the Christian way. The Christian way says we're special because God loves us. We're special because Christ died for us. We are special because he is risen. And our specialness is a positive specialness. So we can always look at any situation and say, we're different, we're special. And said, we actually have to have a conversion of mind, a metanoia, to say, if we can present a unified witness to the risen one, we will actually be all richer. And so that's the value of trying to overcome and trying to go over, and instead of going the other way and saying, what makes me different? Let's, you know, I think there is a positive religious value. We are calendar animals. We are liturgical animals, and we share the gospel. And if we can bring those into harmony, that is a positive value. And that leaves us with a practical question then. People forget how hard it was for the West to accept the new Gregorian calendar. There's still an echo of it in the fact that the tax year in Britain ends on the 5th of April. The scientists concluded their work and they presented the work to Pope Gregory, and he said, okay, we'll go with it. But it took several centuries to quite see it's better if we work together. And so the practical question is then is there a way that we can move towards singing with one voice in one moment that he is risen, without losing face and without feeling? See, the problem is we don't want to say, as Vassa said, you know, we didn't want to lose out to the Armenians and we didn't want to lose out to some other gang, right? Okay. Well, how do you, so that you don't lose out to the Finland church, you don't lose out to this church, you don't lose out to the Latins. The trick is to have some way of saying, hey, let's just get over it, but let's do it in such a way that it doesn't mean that we're hauling, you know, we don't want any symbolism of, you know, that thing, we're hauling down the flag. We're not hauling down the flag. We're putting all our flags in one big field of flags. So I think that one of the things we have to address as liturgists is, how do you actually move so that people don't feel we're given into the Armenians or someone else?
Thank you, Tom. And Mary, go ahead. Unmute, yes.
I'm not sure I have a great deal to add. I'm glad we came back to the gospel, and that we tend to forget that this is a universal church and Christ came to save all human beings, sinners, everyone. But I also liked what Sister Vassa was saying, because I think we have these issues with us. They're not going away. So we have to decide, how do we deal with them? And I think it's not about saying they're not important. Perhaps there's another way through of recognizing that the 25th of December is the 25th of December for new and old calendarists. It just happens to be celebrated on a different day, but it is still the date of the Nativity of Christ according to our liturgical calendar. And somehow make light of this, respect others, and celebrate together even if separately, I think is how I would see going forward, but not make these be barriers.
Thank you, Mary. Sister Vassa?
Well, yes, thank you for the additional insights of everybody. Well, I think I made that point. I don't think that it's, I think we're so exposed to other ways of doing things that it's okay. I could share that in the Moscow Patriarchate, you know, this question came up. I'm a member of the canonical, or the Commission for Canon Law of the Moscow Patriarchate, which is known as the Inter-Council Presence. So we create documents ahead of that happen only periodically of big church councils. Anyway, so a document came up ahead of what I call the H&G Council, the Holy and Great Council in Crete, that we were supposed to put out a document that says about the calendar question. So what do we propose, or what do we think about the calendar question, before it was sort of swept under the rug, and Crete did not have anything to say about the calendar issue, as if it doesn't exist, because as soon as we discuss something that really needs to be discussed, the conversation is always about, this will create schism, you know, as if it's not already creating that. And if you ignore it, you know, things will get somehow better with Orthodox unity. But anyway, I thought, oh, okay, we're going to discuss this calendar issue. But the way the presider of the commission, and I sit there as a, I don't even know really why the patriarch put me on this commission. It's only like metropolitans and, you know, men in funny hats there, but God bless them, of course. But anyway, they said at the beginning of all of this, look, this is already decided, so we're not going to have a discussion. It was like they put this issue right before lunchtime, even though usually there is a lively discussion. I don't want to denigrate the whole business of having these commissions. But with this issue, the presider said, we don't need to discuss this one. He presented us with a very brief document saying this is not an issue for the Russian Orthodox Church. And I was able to say something, but then something very, you know, something was said. I mentioned that it's not, people are not aware with what Professor Cunningham just said. The numerology and the significance that we have a common date is not something that people understand. People don't understand that January 7th is really December 25th. Try if you're teaching catechism to children to explain that to them. You know what, children? It's really, it's too much. So I don't think that I'm not cynical about it, but I think realistically, because I observed how this was dealt with, and not that, you know, church leaders today, it's also part of, there are deep-seated issues here, aside from the inability to have a historical critical approach to anything, right? But there is a crisis, of course, of church authority in general. So you can't suggest anything, even if every member of this commission actually very well knows that it's not a good thing to have the Julian calendar. There is no, forget even about, well, everybody knows that it's inaccurate. And there are lost meanings, you know, like celebrating all the bodiless powers on November 8th has numerological significance. And there are writings on this, like why in November, which was the 9th month. Obviously it isn't anymore, but the 9 classes of angels, why is it on November 8th? Because 8 is the magic number 2 in a different way, you know, eternity and those beings. But we celebrate on the older calendar on November 21st. It doesn't mean anything traditionally in that context. And that meaning is lost. And so traditionally speaking, there is no value. The only thing people present, and back in the day when there were certain churches that adopted, like when the OCA in the beginning of the 70s was formed, got its autocephaly, and part of the polemics going on with, you know, I belong to the Row Corps, and so in those years, and then going into the 80s and so forth, when I was a child, I was used to the whole ideology that I embraced as a child as to why the new calendar is evil. And the only issue was, when they switched, even though, sorry, I'm going on and on, but the loss of the 13 days in the initial switch, there's no sense to that, you know. If we were to take the time and the risk of actually telling the truth, like yes, it's going to be a painful process, but I find that and by we, I suppose, I mean anybody who has the opportunity somehow to educate, take the risk of telling the truth, because a lot of times we are not a truth-telling church. That martyria of the church, of telling unpleasant truths in certain areas, is not allowed. And in this issue, as far as my church is concerned, I find that it's taboo. And so that being one of the issues, that people are not taught to be able to deal with change, because they don't know history, they don't know about the changeability of something like calendar. And the only way you can chip away at these defenses and these fears, right? Because the fear comes from a lack of education, is through telling the truth in careful doses, of course, sometimes, but with rolling up our sleeves, I think, and saying, you know, to indicating the truths of these matters.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this important insight. And as a wrapping up, I would like to address to the group what others have shared. And we haven't managed to bring people live in the conversation, but there have been. Father Andreas Andropoulos mentioned the dynamics between the calendar and the New Testament, the saying of Jesus that the Saturday was made for the human being and not the human being for Saturday. Something to consider in our further contemplation about the calendar. Father Timothy Curtis mentioned that we were discussing a lot about sociology of identity and community, and not necessarily approaching this issue theologically. And I think there was a deliberate attempt, and I'm glad we succeeded, because we brought theologians here to talk about now, to talk about problematics of now. And I'm glad that theologians have found the way to talk in a social language, in the community language, with all the insight, with all the theological insight, bringing it for the educational purpose of the webinar. So that is, I would take it as a success of today's. Anastasia Mitrofanova grew up in the country where they celebrated 25th of October on the 7th of November. That really is a testimony of the mystery of the calendars and the identity and the propaganda in this case fitted into it. In a way, I remain overwhelmed about this webinar, because before the idea of the webinar, the calendar in my mind had such a marginal importance and was only humorous in my misunderstanding of its significance. I was not taking calendar that seriously. And after we had the preliminary discussions with Alfred and we brought certain issues, I've realized how fundamental this minuscular, on the one hand, problem, the impact of it on our identity, on our security, on our fundamentality, on our humanity, cannot be underestimated. And I think this webinar really brings to light to the surface just a little bit of the complexity of this question. And I would like to thank Alfred and to encourage Alfred further in your research, which is of enormous significance. And we celebrate your book that is being published already and anticipate eagerly the following book, because you're doing the magnitude of the research and the calculation and the analysis of the whole information, but we need it to support us in our identity, to release us from our insecurities and threats, in our understanding of what our loyalties are, what our identity is, what is the core of it, and how do we expose it to the rest of the world and to each other. And I would like to finish on what you said, Alfred, about set of our loyalties are to God, to the world, and to each other. And
thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video and found it somehow informative, please be sure to click like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We would also love it if you visited the Centre on the web at www.appliedtheology.org.uk and took out a membership. At £20 per year, your membership is one of the main means of support on which we depend to carry out our work. Finally, look for us on social media. We can be found on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. Just do a search for the Centre for Applied Theology. We look forward to having you join us.